Well, not very good place actually, Mark. Yeah, I think one of the things you've highlighted there, wasn't it? It was to stay home, protect the NHS, and what the government would argue is it was to stay home, don't contract COVID and end up in hospital. But most people I know who spoke who thought, well, I better not go and phone my GP. Or I don't feel too good, but yeah, they'd overrun with COVID, so it was more taken to say, stay home. Don't bother the NHS because we're too busy for you. And we spoke last week, didn't we, about one of Rishi Sunak's top five pledges before the next election. That was to kind of stop the votes
Mm.
and cut immigration's another one there. And this one was to cut waiting lists. Now, the way the figures are going, Mark, at the moment, similar to the boats, he's not stopping the boats. He's not getting waiting lists down. So we haven't got that long, 14 months before the next election. So where we are, Mark, I think I sent your production team a graphic which kind of shows waiting lists now over the last
Yeah.
13, 14 years. You can see actually they inherited a position where they were coming down towards the back end of the Tony Blair, Gordon Brown years,
Mm.
and they were relatively stable. Steady incline then throughout the kind of the 2010s, and then you can see a slight dip in the first month of the pandemic. That's partly because obviously people just weren't going to see anybody at all, so people weren't being added on to the waiting lists. But it's been creeping up, and creeping up now, and we've got a record number of 7.3 million people on a waiting list. And there'll be some people; these aren't generally all emergency ones; you tend to get seen a lot quicker. But there'll be people in acute pain. I know of instances, Mark, where some people have given up on the NHS. They're paying to go to Europe, go abroad to get things done themselves because they can't wait because of the excruciating pain that they're in. And yeah, so where are we? He's talked about cutting waiting lists. The pandemic happened. People stayed home, protected the NHS. Waiting lists have gone up, and there's no sign of them coming down at the moment.
Well, there isn't really such a thing as a UK NHS. There's a separate NHS for England, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Wales. So tell us how it's looking in your neck of the woods in Wales.
Well, yeah, I think before we go into that, it's probably worth just highlighting what Keir Starmer did a piece for the Telegraph.
All
He
right.
doesn't normally write for what you would class the Tory
Mm.
graph, I think some people, but he had a piece yesterday. I think he was setting out, he's obviously putting down his marker for the next election, and he's talked about reform of the NHS. And one of the things he said is that, I'm just going to quote him, he says, for 75 years, it's been part of our national story,
Mm.
a source of comfort, security, and health for millions. This is what we must preserve. Well, we just talked about this isn't a source of comfort, security if you're on these waiting lists. And he's talking about giving patients more control. He's talking about putting prevention first rather than just curing people. And he's talking about cutting bureaucracy. So that's Starmer's Labour Party's kind of plan for the NHS. So you're right to say we don't have a UK NHS. We have a devolved situation with health. So Scotland, under the Scottish National Party, will run matters in Scotland. In England, it's obviously the Conservatives. And in Wales, it's kind of Welsh Labour. And what you've got Wes Streeting, who's the kind of the shadow health minister in England, always talking about how the Conservatives are ruining the NHS and we can do things better. Starmer's got his reform plan. But I can tell you, Mark, where I live, and we'll probably go through some numbers in a second, it is much, much worse under the Labour Party in Wales. And my call here is that if Keir Starmer has this great plan, why doesn't he use a test bed of a national country within the UK, show that he can work where he's got control with his party, show that what I'm going to
Yeah.
implement is going to do something, and then it's a vote winner for everywhere, isn't
Yeah.
it? But the Welsh NHS under the Labour Party is in a dire state compared to what you've got under the Tory Party in England.
So that's the one of the four home nations that Keir Starmer already runs in effect. And you're saying that that's no advertisement for the glories of a Labour health service.
No, so I put a tweet out the other day, and we were looking at the kind of the numbers because the BBC, the kind of the local situation here was covering what you've got, and so if you look at Wales and you look at waiting lists, Mark, we've got because obviously you go onto a waiting list, and then you would expect in normal circumstances for the queue to be cleared by the time the order you go on there. So if you've been on there the longest, you'd be expected to see the first. So if you're new on the list, you have a long wait. So what we've got in Wales. We've got 30,000 patients now who've been on the waiting list for at least 2 years. It's 2 years. We're not talking 2 months. We're not talking two
No.
weeks. 2 years they've been on the waiting list. That's about 5% of everybody on a waiting list in Wales. Now in England, the corresponding number is 559, and that's about just about 0.01% of people on the list in Wales. But it's probably unfair just to look at absolute numbers, Mark, because it's 30,000 in Wales, 500 or so in England. But remember, the population of Wales is much, much lower. So if you actually do the maths on that, the people who've been waiting on the waiting list for 2 years is 60 times higher in Wales, with a population which is 18 times lower. That's staggering when you look at the numbers, Mark. And say Welsh Labour have run this health system now for nearly 20 odd years. Starmer's talking about reforming the NHS. I wouldn't want them to reform into what they're doing to us in Wales.
What do people do? I mean, I can't. I've known across my life, Canadians who got tired of waiting for a hip replacement in Alberta, and they spent every winter in the California desert, say in Palm Springs, and so eventually they just wake up one morning and the pain of waiting for your hip replacement is too great, so they go to an American hospital and just write a check and be done with it. What do you do if you're waiting if you're on those numbers? You've actually got the worst wait lists in the UK, because from my memory, Scotland and Northern Ireland do not have that same per capita 2-year wait. What do you do after waiting 2 years?
Well, this is the big thing, really, Mark, is let's say even the local BBC Wales News have been running stories with people who live in Wales who have literally got fed up. They can't wait any longer. They can't afford to go kind of private in the United Kingdom. So what they're doing is you kind of call health tourism. They're going abroad. They go into some countries, in Europe where it's a lot cheaper, and they're getting things done cheaper. And obviously these health systems abroad can do things a lot cheaper than what they are doing in the UK. They seem to have the capacity. Their domestic, people who are living in the countries there don't seem to have the same issues with the health system, which is why when Starmer talks about we need to preserve, the NHS, no other country in the world seems to copy the NHS. I don't see politicians standing up saying, let's look to that NHS in the United Kingdom. That's what we need to aspire towards. Nobody in their right mind would want to aspire to what we've got in the UK at the moment. And that's the sad thing, Mark. You're paying technically twice, because you paid your taxes for your healthcare system, and then, it's not delivering for me. So I've got to pay to go abroad and get it done. And some people I know, Mark, are actually trying to find the cash. They don't want to go abroad. They're finding the cash to go private in the UK themselves. So that's what people are doing if they can't get off these waiting lists, which are going up.
Well, as I understand it, the UK and France pay about the same per capita for the health service, but France has basically twice as many doctors. I mean, let's just address quickly what's changed is that Boris Johnson told everyone that with COVID, don't go near your hospital unless you've got a problem with COVID. It's not the National Health Service anymore, it's the National COVID Service. And as a result of that, there's people who didn't get their cancers diagnosed until it was, not stage 2, but stage 4. And there are consequences to that. Is there an anger at the NHS's reduction into a COVID service and nothing but?
Well, we clearly saw that. As I say, people stayed home to protect the NHS. So the number of people who were being diagnosed with things like cancer, that fell through the pandemic. So there will be people who probably did die before they even had the diagnosis, because that didn't come through in time. But we're beyond the pandemic now, Mark. We're in this living with COVID stage. Even the NHS this week has come out saying we're no longer in a COVID emergency. But you've raised the cancer question there. I was looking at the numbers myself there. So if you get an urgent referral from a GP for some treatment and things, if you look at the figures, about 78% of people would start within 2 months pre-pandemic. Now, they inherited in 2010 a situation where 85% of patients would get there. Obviously, we have got an aging population. Well, there's more and more cancer patients because people are living longer, and they get into that point and we can diagnose more of them as well. But let's go for that pre-pandemic number of 78%. That's now down to around 60%. And this is 3 years on. This is the health system today versus the month before the pandemic started. We haven't got the COVID as much as what it was back then. And, what he's seen is 2 in 5 people now are waiting beyond 62 days. They know they've got cancer, and they're waiting for treatment. And that must be, mentally,
Yeah.
that must be very, very poor for your mental health if you know there's some cancer inside you
No.
and you're waiting to start that treatment when it could be a killer.
No, and it's growing there. I never liked that line that, I mean, there needs to be a wholesale rethink of this. Keir Starmer is doing that whole NHS fetishization thing that failed during the COVID era. And I always thought that line, oh, the NHS is the envy of the world. As you pointed out, no other country goes to this system. And I once joked in the Daily Telegraph that you might be able to find a Bhutanese yak farmer who admired the NHS. And like a week later, I got a letter from the son of yak farmers in Bhutan saying that the Bhutanese health service was way better than the United Kingdom's. There needs to be a wholesale rethink of this stuff. Thank you very much as always, Jamie. You can check Jamie out on the internet at statsjamie.co.uk, or you can tweet him at statsjamie.